He was a nameless orphan, freezing to death in a storm no one could survive, until he heard a cry in the snow. What he did next would not only save a life, but summon 500 warriors to the edge of a terrified town and change the course of history. Stay with us, because you won't believe how this ends. A scream lost in the wind, that's how it began. The blizzard came with no warning, no slow darkening of skies, no gentle rustle of leaves turning in dread. It arrived like a blade drawn from the throat of the plains, slicing across the bones of Fort Laramie, Wyoming. By nightfall, the entire prairie howled like a wounded animal, and most folks had barricaded themselves inside their cabins, clinging to the warmth of flickering oil lamps and whispered prayers. But Lucas Marin wasn't inside. Lucas never had a place to be. No home, no family, no name on any town ledger. Just a 13-year-old boy with frostbitten fingers, 2 large boots, and a ghost's place in a town that barely knew he existed. They called him the Quiet One when they bothered to call him anything at all. He slept in barns, under porches, in the dusty corners of Fort Laramie's forgotten places. He lived off rabbit traps and leftover stew from kind souls like old May Donovan, who left him food without ever asking questions. Lucas had learned long ago that silence was safer than hope. That afternoon, with the first snowflakes already ghosting across the prairie, Lucas was miles outside of town, checking traps near the broken fence by Split Oak Ridge. He'd caught a single rabbit, a scrawny, twitching thing that might keep him warm if not full. It wasn't much, it never was, but he smiled to himself as he looped it to his belt. Survival was its own kind of triumph. Then the wind shifted. He felt it before he heard it, a drop in air pressure so sharp it made his ears pop. The sky changed colors, gray to bruised blue to a shade that made even the trees look afraid. Birds vanished. The world went still. Then came the storm. Snow hit him sideways, blinding, biting, swallowing the horizon in minutes. He lost the trail first, then his sense of direction, then his breath. The wind roared in a way that didn't feel natural. It carried something more than snow, something ancient, something alive. He stumbled toward what he thought was town, using the wind's direction against his cheek as his compass. He'd walked this land since he could crawl. But that day, everything was wrong. That's when he heard it. A sound, barely audible above the storm's rage, but unmistakable. A child's cry, not a coyote, not the shriek of bending timber or wind through the canyon. A voice, small, human, fragile, somewhere out in the white nothing. He stopped. Every instinct screamed at him to keep moving, to save his own life. He was already half frozen. His scarf had iced stiff to his face. His toes were numb. Turning toward that sound would cost him everything. But he didn't move forward. He turned. Something inside him, a memory, maybe, rose from where he'd buried it. His little sister's voice. The last time he heard her cry before the fever took her, that sound had lived in his ribs ever since, buried but never forgotten. This voice, in the blizzard, sounded just like hers. He waded deeper into the white. Visibility was gone. Even shapes 10 feet away vanished into fog. But he followed the cry, pausing, listening, recalibrating. The snow swallowed his footprints seconds after he made them. Time didn't exist here, only the sound and his resolve. Minutes, maybe hours, passed before he saw the shape. A small, huddled figure, half buried in snow, unmoving. Lucas dropped to his knees, brushing snow away from a child curled into herself like a dying flame. She wore a buckskin dress, adorned with hand-stitched beads now crusted with ice. Her hair had frozen in stiff tendrils, and her cheeks had taken on the dangerous gray of cold too deep to come back from. A Shoshone girl, maybe 8 years old. Her lips were blue, her eyes fluttered open, just barely. She didn't speak, but he didn't need words. Her look said everything: fear, confusion, and something worse: surrender. Lucas's first instinct was disbelief. What was she doing out here? Where was her family? Had they left her? Had something happened? He scanned the surroundings. Nothing but snow and silence. No tracks, no shadows, just her. He stripped off his coat, wrapping it around her, then placed her icy hands inside the warm carcass of the rabbit hanging from his belt. A trapper's trick to bring warmth back. He rubbed her shoulders, whispered nonsense words. Anything to keep her awake. She stared at him, and her eyes filled with tears. Not because she was saved, but because she understood what it meant that he was trying. He lifted her. She weighed nothing. A wisp. He could feel the cold from her skin leaching into his chest as he held her tight, shielding her with his body from the knife of the wind. Turning back, he tried to find his own trail. Impossible. The storm had erased the world. Still, he pressed forward, step by step, breath by breath, through the wind and the dark, with a child in his arms and a storm in his face. No one saw him leave town. No one would have known he was gone. And yet, if he didn't make it back, if he froze out here in the storm, there would be one less orphan and no one to tell the story. But if he did, the world would never be the same, and neither would Fort Laramie. The storm deepened. Lucas couldn't tell how long he'd been walking. The world had reduced to one color, one sound, white and howling. His arms ached from carrying her, but he didn't loosen his grip. The girl had stopped shivering, and that scared him more than anything. Shivering meant the body was still fighting. Still alive, still trying. When the shivering stopped, it usually meant something else. He looked down at her. Her eyes were closed, lashes crusted with ice. Her skin, once the warm brown of earth, had taken on a bluish tint. She was fading. He had no idea how far he was from town, no landmarks, no trail. Nothing to guide him but the ghost of his own steps and a memory of home that never quite belonged to him. Lucas pressed her closer to his chest, shifting her weight so she wouldn't slip. "Stay with me," he whispered, not knowing whether she could hear. "Please, just stay." The wind screamed louder, as if daring him to continue. It was alive, he was sure of it now, more than just weather. It was something that had seen too much, devoured too many. It clawed at his face, tugged at his scarf, bit into every patch of exposed skin. His legs were lead. Every step was a war. His boots sank into drifts that reached his knees, and the snow fell so thick it swallowed the sound of his breathing. He thought of stopping, just for a moment. But he didn't. Not yet. Then, just ahead, a break in the white. A ridge of stone, half buried but solid. Shelter. Lucas trudged forward, falling twice before reaching the narrow cleft between two rocks. It wasn't much, a shallow hollow, barely more than a dent in the hillside, but it broke the wind. Inside, silence reigned, muffled and strange. It felt like the inside of a heartbeat. He set the girl down gently on a patch of snow-packed earth. She didn't stir. Lucas tore off his gloves, fumbled with the rabbit carcass at his belt, then reached for the small knife he kept in his boot. Hands shaking, he slit the animal open, just enough to reach the warmth inside. He guided the girl's stiff fingers into the rabbit's belly, murmuring apologies under his breath, hoping she would flinch, resist, anything. Still nothing. Panic surged in his chest. He needed warmth, fire. But there was no wood, nothing dry. His hands were useless. fingers numb, skin cracked and bleeding. He remembered what old May had once said, during a winter just as cruel. "Your body's the best fire you've got. Don't waste it on pride." So he lay down beside her. Lucas pulled her into his chest, wrapping his arms and legs around her in a tight ball. His coat was already gone, wrapped around her like a shell. He had nothing left but himself. He pressed his forehead against hers and whispered stories, not from books, but the ones he used to tell his sister when the fever came. Tales of wolves who sang to the moon, of stars that guided lost travelers home, of a mother's voice carried on the wind. He told them, in half words, half hopes, words meant more for himself than for her. And finally, he felt it. A twitch. Her fingers jerked just once. Lucas froze, then looked down. Her mouth moved. No sound came out at first, but then a soft hum. A melody, strange and lilting, filled with notes he didn't recognize. It wasn't English, it wasn't anything he'd heard before, but it was beautiful. She was singing. Her eyes opened, and she looked up at him. Not startled, not afraid, just calm. Her gaze found his, and for a moment the blizzard didn't exist. It was just them, two children who didn't belong to anyone but each other. She pointed at her chest. "Ayla," she said, her voice cracked and hoarse. Lucas blinked. "Ayla?" he repeated, and she nodded. He smiled through cracked lips. "Lucas?" he said, pointing to himself. Another small nod. Her fingers reached for the locket around his neck, the copper circle he always wore, the only thing he had left from his mother. She touched it gently, as if recognizing its meaning. He unlatched the chain and placed it in her palm. "For you," he whispered. She tried to protest, shaking her head, but he closed her fingers around it. That moment, simple and wordless, was the most sacred thing Lucas had ever known. The wind still roared beyond their little stone cave, but something inside it had changed. It no longer felt like it wanted to kill them. It felt like it was watching. Lucas stayed awake the rest of the night, watching Ayla's chest rise and fall. Her color returned slowly. She slept, murmuring soft words in her language, words that sounded like prayers or lullabies. When dawn broke, it wasn't through sunlight. It was through quiet. The wind stopped. Lucas knew the worst was over. He helped Ayla to her feet, supporting her as they stepped back out into the frozen world. Their footprints were gone. Nothing but a blank white canvas ahead. Somewhere beyond this storm was Fort Laramie. Somewhere they'd find a way back. And somewhere, Lucas knew, this wasn't the end of their story. It was only the beginning. The barn loomed out of the white like a ghost made of timber and time. Lucas didn't remember the last 100 steps, only that they appeared, somehow, like a memory that hadn't quite happened yet. His legs moved because they had to. His arms burned from the weight of Ayla, but he held her tighter with every gust of wind. Her body, though warmer than before, still felt far too light. He was afraid to look too closely, afraid to find her slipping away again. The side door stuck. Ice crusted its hinges, but Lucas shoved hard until it groaned open. Inside, the cold didn't end, but it changed, muted, less aggressive. The wind became a dull hum beyond the wooden walls. The dim light filtered through cracks, casting slivers of gray across the straw-covered floor. He stepped inside, stumbled once, and lowered Ayla onto a hay pile that smelled faintly of horses and old cedar. He collapsed beside her, chest heaving. For a moment, neither moved, just breathe, just being. And then she opened her eyes. Lucas smiled. It hurt. His lips cracked and raw, but it came anyway. "You're safe," he whispered. Ayla didn't answer. She just looked at him, steady, curious, and so heartbreakingly tired. She pulled his mother's locket from beneath her coat and held it out in her small hand. He shook his head. Number, it's yours now. She frowned, uncertain. But when he reached out and gently closed her fingers around it, she didn't fight him. Instead, she tucked it close to her chest and closed her eyes again. That's how May Donovan found them. She'd come to the barn for kindling, wrapped in 3 layers of shawls and boots older than most of the town. She was halfway to the pile of firewood when she saw the children curled in the hay, one familiar, one foreign. "Dear Lord," she breathed. Lucas stirred. When he saw her, relief crashed over him like another storm. "She needs help," he said. "She was alone out there." May didn't ask questions, not yet. She knelt beside Ayla and felt her forehead, her neck, her fingertips. Her hands moved with the care of someone who had done this before, who had saved lives and watched others slip away. "We've got work to do," she said softly. "Come on, boy." Lucas followed her orders like gospel. Together they stripped off Ayla's wet layers, dried her skin with flannel rags, wrapped her in wool blankets that smelled of cedar and thyme. May brought over a battered tin chest she kept for emergencies, a gift left behind by a traveling tinker years ago. Inside were treasures: matches, a tin of pine resin, a bottle of medicinal whiskey, and a half-used oil lantern. May lit the flame, and warmth bloomed in the space between them. The world felt smaller now, contained, survivable. Lucas poured a capful of whiskey and held it to Ayla's lips. She coughed, gagged, but swallowed. Then he took a sip himself, warmth burning down his throat like a second chance. Together, they worked on her, foot, raw and pale, where the moccasin had torn. Lucas dabbed whiskey onto the exposed skin, and Ayla cried out, a sound that broke something open in him. "It's a good sign," May said gently. "Means the nerves are still alive." They wrapped her in horse blankets and tucked her against Lucas's chest once more. This time, the heat between them wasn't desperation. It was survival. May sat nearby, feeding the small fire she'd built in a clay brazier with kindling from the rafters. "You know what they'll say," she said, almost to herself, "when they find out what you brought back." Lucas said nothing. She turned to him. "You did right, doesn't matter what they say." The knock came an hour later, sharp and urgent. The storm still roared, but not enough to keep out Fort Laramie's whispers. Word had spread. By mid-morning, a half-dozen townspeople had gathered in May's parlor, boots dripping on the floor, steam rising from soaked coats. Sheriff Baker stood in the center, arms folded, his face tight with worry. Mr. Hudson, the shopkeeper, paced by the hearth, casting sharp glances at the bundle of blankets on May's couch. "She's Shoshone," he said. "What if they come looking for her? Think we took her?" "They will come," May replied, not unkindly. "And if they do, we'll tell them the truth. That won't stop them if they're angry." Lucas sat apart from the crowd, listening. "Why'd you bring her here?" Hudson asked suddenly, turning to Lucas. "Could have left her." Lucas looked up, calm but firm. "She would have died." "She still might," someone muttered. "And then we've got a dead Indian girl in our barn." "Enough," Sheriff Baker said. "He did what no grown man had the guts to do. That counts for something." May poured tea in chipped mugs, passed them around without asking. The warmth didn't touch the room's tension. "We'll keep her here until the storm clears," the sheriff said finally. "Then we'll figure it out." Lucas rose and returned to Ayla. She opened her eyes when he knelt, and for the first time since the storm, she smiled. It was small, barely there, but it was real. She pointed at herself. "Ayla?" He nodded. "Lucas?" The crowd behind him kept debating, arguing about danger and boundaries and things they didn't understand, but none of it mattered. Not in that moment. Because in a town that had never seen him, never truly known him, Lucas had just become something more than a shadow. He had become a protector. And somewhere out there, across the snow-covered plains, people were coming. Warriors, family, answers. But for now, all that mattered was this. She was alive, and he wasn't invisible anymore. The storm broke just before dawn. It didn't fade the way most storms did. It withdrew, as if something had called it off, pulling its fury back across the plains and leaving behind a world that looked like it had been scrubbed clean by the hands of ghosts. The snow glittered under the faint light of early morning, and the air hung silent, still, like the earth had paused to breathe again. Lucas was already awake. He'd barely slept. Every time he'd drifted, he'd startled awake with the image of Ayla's frozen face burned into his mind. But she was warm now, her breathing steady. Her small hand still curled around the copper locket beneath her blanket. He watched her sleep for a while before rising, quietly crossing the barn to peer out through the cracks in the wood. What he saw made his breath catch. Across the frozen Platte River, silhouetted against the pale fire of sunrise, stood a line of riders. Silent, motionless. Too many to count at first, but then he began to see them clearly. Row upon row, mounted warriors stretching along the ridge like shadows cast from another time. Their horses stood with heads high, steam rising from their nostrils in slow clouds. Feathers caught the light. Spears glinted. Lucas didn't move. He wasn't sure he could. Something ancient stood there. Something that belonged to the land more than Fort Laramie ever had. He felt it in his chest like a drum. He turned back into the barn. Ayla was sitting up, rubbing her eyes. When she saw his face, she froze. "They're here," he said. She didn't ask who. She didn't need to. Within minutes, the town stirred. May had already seen them through her frost-covered windows. Word spread fast. Too fast. Doors slammed. Boots stomped through snow. Panic moved like a second storm. Lucas, May, and Ayla stood just outside the barn as Sheriff Baker approached, rifle in hand but lowered. Behind him, a small group of men followed. Some brave, others just scared enough to want to stand near a badge. Mr. Hudson was among them, his eyes sharp and filled with unease. "They're across the river," the sheriff said. "Maybe 500, maybe more." "Then, let's not make any sudden moves," May replied calmly. "They'll want the girl," Hudson said. "We need to send her out before they come here looking." "She's not a package to return," May snapped. "She's a child." Lucas stood silently beside Ayla. She hadn't spoken, but her eyes never left the distant line of warriors. Sheriff Baker looked at them both and nodded. "They'll want to see she's safe. We'll go to them." "You're going to walk out there?" Hudson asked. "I'll walk with him," May said. The sheriff's gaze turned to Lucas. "You too, son, if you're willin'. They'll want to see the one who found her." Lucas swallowed hard. He felt Ayla's fingers slip into his again, just like in the cave, and he nodded. They crossed the snow-covered field. Together, May, the sheriff, Lucas, and Ayla, moving toward the river while the town watched in heavy silence. People stood on porches and near windows, guns in hand, hearts in throats. The morning was bright, but it felt like twilight. As they neared the bridge, a single rider broke from the line. He moved slowly, deliberately, his horse walking with the measured grace of ritual. He wore a great headdress, adorned with eagle feathers that trailed in the wind like the tail of a comet. His face was lined with time, but his eyes burned with fire. "Chief Tanapa." Ayla saw him and stopped. Her grip on Lucas tightened, and for a moment he thought she might run. But then she stepped forward. Not in fear, not in hesitation, but with certainty. Tanapa dismounted with fluid ease. He walked alone, leaving his horse behind, a gesture that spoke of trust and tradition. When he reached them, he did not look first at the sheriff or at May. He looked at Ayla. She took 3 steps and ran. He caught her in his arms with a low sound that was half sob, half prayer. He lifted her easily, pressed his forehead to hers and held her there, still and silent, father and child, though he was her grandfather. The wind itself seemed to pause. The moment stretched, then passed. Tanapa set Ayla down gently, and then his gaze turned to Lucas. The boy straightened, though every part of him trembled. He had no words prepared, no explanation, just the truth. She was alone, he said softly. She needed help. Tanapa studied him. The old man's eyes were dark, but not unkind. They searched Lucas, not just his face but his soul. And then he spoke, his English accented but strong. "You walked through death with her in your arms," Tanapa said. "You did not run. You did not turn away. Why?" Lucas hesitated, then answered simply, "Because no one else would have." A long silence followed. Then, slowly, Tanapa reached beneath his robe and pulled out a leather cord. On it hung a pendant. Stone carved into the shape of the rising sun, surrounded by beads and feathers. He stepped forward and placed it around Lucas's neck. "You have a warrior's heart," Tanapa said. "My people honor those who protect children. You are now under our protection, as if born to our fires." The words settled like snow, quiet but heavy with meaning. Behind them, the line of riders lifted their right hands in a silent salute, not to the town, not to the sheriff, but to Lucas. A boy who had once been invisible now stood at the center of something far greater. Sheriff Baker exhaled slowly. He turned to Tanapa and bowed his head. "We feared this would end in blood." "It does not have to," the chief replied. "This boy showed us another way." Ayla took Lucas's hand again. The weight of the pendant around his neck felt unfamiliar, but right. Not a gift. A vow. Behind them, Fort Laramie watched. And for the first time in years, perhaps ever, something stronger than fear passed between the people of the town and the people on the ridge. Understanding. The snow lingered longer than usual that year, as if reluctant to loosen its grip on the land it had conquered. But spring came anyway. Slowly, stubbornly, it pushed its fingers into the earth, cracking the ice, drawing green from frost-bitten soil. And with it came something else. A shift. Subtle at first, then undeniable. Fort Laramie changed. Not because someone passed a law, not because an agreement was signed, but because a boy no one had noticed carried a child no one wanted to see through a storm that should have killed them both. Because when Lucas Marin stepped back across the bridge that day, still wearing the sunstone pendant Chief Tanapa had placed around his neck, he no longer walked in anyone's shadow. The town watched him now, not with pity, not with suspicion, but with the quiet reverence they reserved for things that didn't make sense on paper, things that belonged to a deeper truth, carved into the land and memory like wind-carved stones. He didn't ask for it, didn't want attention. But the story traveled farther than the wind ever could. First, from porch to porch, then to neighboring settlements. Soon, riders from as far as Cheyenne came to hear it firsthand. From the boy who had braved the blizzard, from the girl who had survived it, and from the townspeople who had nearly let fear ruin what compassion saved. Chief Tanapa returned within the week, not with warriors this time, but with elders, herbalists, and young families. They came bearing dried meat, fur blankets, roots for healing. In exchange, May Donovan taught their daughters how to can fruit. Mr. Hudson, surprisingly, offered flour and tools from his store, free of charge at first. Later, they bartered. The town square began to buzz not just with trade, but with laughter in two languages. Ayla came often. Her face, once fragile and afraid, now lit with curiosity and confidence. She brought her cousins. She brought stories. Sometimes she brought silence and sat next to Lucas on the riverbank, saying nothing. He never asked questions. She never owed him answers. That was their understanding. They built a school that summer, simple, made of pine and sweat. But inside, it held something rare. Both Shoshone and settler children learning side by side. Lucas helped teach them how to track animal signs and find fresh water in dry soil. Ayla showed them which roots to chew for fever. Sheriff Baker gave lessons in reading and writing. And every morning, May lit the stove, just to warm the place with the smell of something cooking. They called Lucas the Pathwalker. Not because he'd earned a title, but because that's what he became. Someone who knew both roads and walked neither alone. He carried messages between the settlement and the tribal camps, settled disputes with quiet logic and the weight of what he'd already done. When tempers rose, people lowered their voices at the sound of his name. There was a harvest celebration in early October. The first time both communities had ever joined hands to mark a shared season. They held it by the riverbank, where the snow had once threatened to claim 2 young lives. Women hung lanterns from trees, and the air filled with drumbeats, fiddle strings, and wood smoke. Ayla danced in a circle of girls, her feet moving to rhythms older than the town itself. Lucas watched from the edge, the pendant against his chest catching the firelight. At the end of the night, Chief Tanapa placed a carved stone at the foot of the old bridge. No inscription, no names. Just 2 sets of footprints, one small, one larger, etched into the surface like a path half buried in snow. It was not a monument to victory. It was a reminder of a moment that changed everything. Years passed. Seasons came and went. Children grew up. Faces aged. The world outside Fort Laramie spun forward, fast and hungry. But the story held. Travelers stopped to ask about the footprints by the bridge. Locals told them about the blizzard, about the orphan boy and the Shoshone girl, about the morning when 500 warriors stood in silence, not as conquerors, but as family reclaimed. They spoke of how a single act of courage burned brighter than centuries of suspicion. Lucas never left. He could have. Offers came, schools in the east, jobs in the rail towns. But he stayed. Not because he was afraid of the world, but because he had already helped build something worth protecting. His home was no longer a barn. It was every corner of Fort Laramie touched by kindness. Ayla visited every spring, even after she married, even after she had children of her own. She'd bring them to the bridge, place their small hands on the stone footprints, and whisper the story, not as a legend, but as a memory. Her daughter once asked her, "Is the boy in the story real?" Ayla smiled. "He still walks this town. Just listen for him." And sometimes, on quiet mornings, you could find Lucas at the river's edge, watching the water move east, carrying with it the sounds of drums, the hush of snowfall, the echo of a child's cry caught in the wind. The pendant still hung around his neck, weathered and faded, but its weight unchanged. He wore it not as a symbol of what he'd done, but of who he had become. Not a warrior, not a hero, just a boy who chose to stop and listen. And because of that choice, 2 worlds found a reason to meet in the middle, and never walk alone again. He was a ghost in his own town, a boy without a name on any ledger, without a roof to call home, without a soul who truly saw him. And yet, when the snow came down like blades from the sky and the winds roared to erase everything warm and human, it was Lucas Marin who stepped into the storm, not for glory, not for recognition, but because he heard a cry, and no one else did. That single act, a decision made in the silence between survival and sacrifice, changed everything. Lucas didn't know who the child was. He didn't know the politics, the fear, or the danger wrapped around her presence. What he knew was that a little girl was dying alone in the snow. He knew what it felt like to be forgotten. And something inside him, call it memory, call it instinct, call it love, would not let him walk away. He carried Ayla through a blizzard that had already claimed stronger, older lives. He used every ounce of knowledge he'd earned from years surviving alone. He gave her his warmth, his strength, his voice, and even the last piece of his family. A copper locket, the only thing he had left of his mother. And when he collapsed through the barn door, half frozen, carrying a child that history told him to fear, he was not just saving her, he was saving the town. He was saving what we all forget too easily, our shared humanity. The days that followed could have gone another way. Fear, after all, is loud. Suspicion, louder. And for a town like Fort Laramie, with its long, tense history with the Shoshone people, Ayla's presence could have been the match to a fire they'd barely kept contained. But something shifted. Because courage is louder still. Because a child had lived. Because a boy had risked everything. Because when Chief Tanapa looked into Lucas's eyes and saw not an enemy, but a kindred spirit, the walls between two worlds cracked wide open. What began as an act of instinct became a symbol, and symbols, when rooted in truth, are hard to ignore. Over time, mistrust gave way to moments of understanding. Trade was born not from need, but from respect. Children sat beside one another in classrooms built with rough timber and rougher hands. The land, once drawn and divided by fear, became a place of shared stories, shared sorrows, and shared joy. And Lucas Marin, the boy who had once been invisible, became the bridge. He never asked for thanks, never demanded recognition. He simply showed up, day after day, walking the path between two people who had long forgotten how to speak each other's names without fear. They called him the Pathwalker, not because he chose a side, but because he chose everyone. He chose the quiet power of doing what's right when no one is watching. He chose action over anger, empathy over safety. He chose Ayla, a girl who grew to carry her own legacy, whose children now run along the riverbank she almost never saw again. The carved footprints at the base of the old bridge, one small, one larger, are not just for them. They are for all of us, for every person who's ever felt unseen, for every voice that's gone unheard, for every moment when a decision, however small, could change the course of an entire community. And that's what this story leaves us with. A lesson, both timeless and urgent. In our world today, we are so often divided by ideology, by geography, by stories we've been told and never questioned. We are taught to protect ourselves, to fear what we do not understand, to prioritize survival over compassion. But Lucas shows us another way. That bravery does not always roar. It sometimes walks quietly into the storm with a child in its arms. That true strength lies not in force, but in gentleness. That the most profound change begins when one person, just one, decides that someone else's life matters as much as their own. This is not just a story of a boy and a girl. It's a blueprint. It tells us that our actions, especially when no one expects them, especially when they cost us comfort, can ripple through time. That we don't need to be heroes or warriors or leaders. We just need to care. So how do we bring this into our lives today? We start small. We listen longer. We see the people we've overlooked. We help someone without calculating the return. We speak up when silence feels safer. We remember that kindness, especially in moments of fear, is never weakness. It is defiance against despair. And when storms come, because they will, we carry each other. Just like Lucas did. If this story touched you, if it reminded you of the power we each hold in the choices we make, then we ask one small thing. Subscribe to our channel. Not because we want numbers, but because every click, every share, every moment of engagement fuels our mission to keep telling stories like this. Stories of humanity, of forgotten voices, of unsung heroes who walk among us still. Help us keep these stories alive. Help us bring more light to the frontier, both past and present, because somewhere out there another storm is coming. And someone, maybe someone like you, will need to decide whether to walk away or walk into it. Just like Lucas did, we'll be here to tell that story too. Subscribe now, and let's keep walking. Together.